She says I don't deserve dinner. The little girl's voice was quiet, but the words stopped the entire bakery from breathing for a second. She says good girls earn food, and I didn't earn it today. Outside, a cold Chicago wind swept down Madison Street, rattling the glass windows of a small neighborhood bakery, where the smell of fresh bread usually made people feel warm and safe. Tonight, it only made the hunger in Emily Carter's stomach feel sharper. She stood on the tips of her worn sneakers, barely tall enough to see over the counter, clutching 3 wrinkled dollar bills and a few coins in her small hand. The cashier looked at the money, then at the girl's thin coat that clearly wasn't made for 35-degree weather. Emily tried to smile politely, the way adults liked the way teachers always said good children should behave. "How much is the smallest bread you have?" she asked softly. Behind her, the door chimed as another customer walked in, bringing with him the cold air and the quiet authority of someone used to being noticed. Jonathan Reed rarely visited places like this. Billionaires usually didn't step into small bakeries on random city blocks after dark. But tonight, his driver had taken a wrong turn, and curiosity had pulled him through the door. He had planned to buy coffee and leave. Then he heard the girl speak. Jonathan paused halfway across the room, his coat still dusted with snowflakes. The words echoed in his mind in a way that made no sense. A child shouldn't talk about deserving dinner like it was a reward someone might lose. Emily carefully placed her crumpled bills on the counter, as if each dollar carried enormous importance. The cashier gently counted them and hesitated. It wasn't quite enough for even the cheapest loaf. Emily quickly pulled the coins from her pocket, adding them to the small pile. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the cold. Jonathan Reed watched silently from a few steps away, suddenly unable to ignore the quiet gravity of a moment that felt far heavier than the price of bread. Jonathan Reed had spent most of his life in rooms where people spoke about markets, investments, and power. But none of those conversations had ever sounded as strange to him as the quiet voice of the little girl standing at the bakery counter. He remained still near the door, watching as the cashier gently pushed the small pile of coins together again. The woman behind the counter looked at Emily Carter with a softness that suggested she had seen this kind of moment before. Emily quickly noticed the hesitation and lowered her eyes as if she had already expected the answer before it was spoken. She gathered the coins back into her small hand and said politely that it was all right, that she could come back another day when she had earned more. The sentence sounded rehearsed, like something she had been taught to repeat many times. Jonathan felt an unfamiliar weight settle in his chest. In the world he lived in, money solved problems instantly. A single dinner in one of his restaurants cost more than what the girl was holding in her hand. Yet here she was, carefully counting every coin as if each one represented something larger than food. The bakery was warm, filled with the smell of cinnamon and fresh bread, but Emily did not move toward the shelves again. Instead, she stepped back from the counter, preparing to leave with quiet acceptance. That was the moment Jonathan finally walked forward. His polished shoes made a soft sound against the tile floor as he approached the counter. Emily noticed him and immediately stepped aside, assuming he was another customer who deserved to be served first. She kept her gaze lowered, clutching the coins tightly, as if she was afraid someone might take them away. Jonathan looked down at the small pile of bread on display, and then at the girl beside him. Something about the way she stood there, small and patient, and far too careful for someone her age, made him realize this was not just about dinner. Jonathan Reed studied the display case for a moment, pretending to decide between the different loaves of bread, but his attention remained on the little girl standing beside him. Emily Carter had already taken a small step toward the door, as if she did not want to take up space that belonged to paying customers. The cold wind outside rattled the glass again, and Jonathan noticed that her thin coat was 2 sizes too small, the sleeves barely reaching her wrists. He turned to the cashier and calmly asked for 2 warm loaves of bread and a cup of hot chocolate. The cashier nodded and began preparing the order, but Jonathan did not reach for the food when it was ready. Instead, He turned slightly toward Emily. She immediately looked nervous, as if adults speaking to her usually meant she had done something wrong. Jonathan softened his voice the way he had heard good teachers speak to children. He told her that he had accidentally ordered too much food and that it would be a shame for the extra bread and hot chocolate to go to waste. Emily hesitated, her fingers tightening around the coins in her hand. She glanced at the cup of steaming chocolate, then quickly looked away again. Her stomach quietly reminded her how long it had been since lunch, but something stronger than hunger seemed to hold her back. She shook her head politely and whispered that she could not take it because it did not belong to her. Jonathan felt that same strange weight in his chest again. Most children would have reached for the warm drink immediately, especially on a night when the temperature was dropping close to freezing. But Emily stood there carefully repeating the rule that had clearly been taught to her many times. She explained in a small voice that she was only allowed to eat dinner if she earned it. Jonathan Reed slowly realized that the quiet sentence he had overheard earlier was not a joke or a childish misunderstanding. For this girl, dinner was something that had to be deserved. Emily Carter continued standing beside the counter with the quiet patience of someone who had learned not to ask for too much from the world. The warm cup of hot chocolate sat on the counter, sending thin curls of steam into the air, and the smell of fresh bread filled the bakery. Yet she kept her hands wrapped around the small pile of coins, as if they were the only permission she had to exist in that room. Jonathan Reed slowly pushed the bread and the hot chocolate closer to her. His voice remained calm and gentle as he explained that sometimes adults ordered more than they could finish, and that sharing extra food was simply the practical thing to do. Emily looked at the bread again, then at Jonathan, studying his face with careful suspicion that seemed far older than her years. She was trying to decide whether accepting kindness might break a rule she could not afford to break. After a long moment, she quietly asked if he was certain the food did not belong to someone else. Jonathan nodded and assured her that it belonged to whoever needed it most tonight. The cashier behind the counter watched silently, her expression soft, but understanding that this moment was not about a bakery transaction anymore. Emily finally reached out and took the cup of hot chocolate with both hands, holding it close to her chest, as if the warmth alone was a rare gift. She did not drink immediately. Instead, she whispered a careful thank you and then glanced toward the bakery window where the cold Chicago street stretched under pale streetlights. Jonathan noticed the way she looked outside, not with curiosity, but with calculation, as if she was measuring how long she could stay before someone expected her to be somewhere else. He gently asked if she lived nearby. Emily nodded and said that her house was only a few blocks away, about a 10-minute walk if she hurried. Jonathan asked whether someone was waiting for her at home. Emily hesitated again before answering. She explained that her father worked late shifts most nights, and that her stepmother expected her back before the porch light turned off. The way she said it sounded less like a normal household rule, and more like a deadline she could not miss. Jonathan Reed felt the quiet unease in his chest grow stronger because something about the careful way Emily spoke made it clear that dinner was only the smallest part of a much larger story. Emily Carter wrapped both hands around the warm cup of hot chocolate, as if the heat might disappear if she did not hold it carefully enough. For several seconds, she simply stood there letting the warmth reach her fingers before finally taking a small sip. The taste seemed to surprise her, and Jonathan Reed noticed the way her shoulders relaxed just a little. It was the first moment she looked like a normal 8-year-old instead of someone quietly carrying responsibilities that did not belong to a child. Jonathan leaned against the counter, keeping his tone casual so she would not feel questioned. He asked if she liked school. Emily nodded politely and said that her teacher was kind and that reading time was her favorite part of the day. She explained that the school library stayed open until 4 o'clock and that she sometimes stayed there longer than the other children because it was warm and quiet. Jonathan asked what kind of books she liked. Emily thought about the question carefully before answering that she liked stories where someone unexpected helped the main character at the very end. She said it in a way that suggested she had read many such stories, but had not yet decided whether those endings were real or only something that happened inside books. Jonathan felt something tighten in his chest again. He watched as she broke a small piece of bread and ate slowly, almost thoughtfully, as if she was trying to make the food last longer. When she noticed him watching, she quickly apologized and explained that she would not take the bread home because that would not be allowed. Jonathan gently asked what she meant by that. Emily lowered her voice and explained that her stepmother believed children should learn discipline, and discipline meant earning every meal. If Emily helped with chores or behaved perfectly at school, then dinner was permitted. If she made mistakes or did not finish everything she was asked to do, then she had to wait until the next day. Jonathan remained silent for a moment after hearing that explanation. In boardrooms, he had negotiated deals worth billions of dollars, yet at this quiet bakery counter, he suddenly realized there were problems that money alone could not immediately solve, especially when a child had already been taught to believe that hunger was simply part of growing up. Jonathan Reed listened carefully as Emily Carter finished the last small piece of bread, eating slowly and politely, as if she was afraid the food might disappear if she moved too quickly. The bakery remained quiet, except for the low hum of a refrigerator and the distant sound of cars moving through the cold Chicago night outside. Jonathan glanced at the clock above the door and realized that more time had passed than he expected. Emily noticed the clock as well, and the moment she saw the minute hand moving closer to the next hour, her posture changed. She quickly placed the empty cup back on the counter and wiped her hands on the sleeves of her coat, suddenly looking anxious. Jonathan gently asked if everything was all right. Emily nodded quickly, but explained that she needed to start walking home soon, because the porch light usually turned off around 7:30, and that was the signal she was expected to be inside. Jonathan looked toward the dark street beyond the bakery window, and then back at the small girl standing beside him. The idea of her walking alone through the freezing evening air for several blocks did not sit well with him. He calmly offered to have his driver give her a ride home, explaining that the car was already waiting outside, and it would only take a few minutes. Emily's reaction was immediate and careful. She shook her head and said that she was not allowed to ride in cars with strangers, even if they seemed kind. Jonathan respected the answer. Instead, he asked if he could simply walk part of the way with her to make sure she stayed warm and safe. Emily hesitated again, clearly measuring the request against the rules she had been taught. After a moment, she explained that as long as they stayed on the main street, it would probably be acceptable because people from the neighborhood would see them. Jonathan nodded with a quiet understanding that told her he was not trying to break any boundaries. The cashier offered Emily a small paper bag with the remaining bread inside, saying that sometimes bakeries gave away extra food at the end of the evening. Emily looked uncertain, but accepted it when the woman insisted. A few minutes later, the bakery door opened and the cold wind rushed in again, as Jonathan Reed and Emily Carter stepped out onto the dimly lit sidewalk together, beginning a short walk that neither of them yet realized would change both of their lives. The cold Chicago air felt sharper the moment Jonathan Reed and Emily Carter stepped onto the sidewalk. The wind moving between the tall buildings like a quiet warning that night was settling in quickly. Emily held the small paper bag of bread close to her chest, while walking beside him, her short steps quick but careful, as if she was used to moving through the city without drawing attention. Streetlights cast long yellow reflections across the pavement, and traffic moved steadily a few blocks away. But this particular street remained mostly quiet. Jonathan slowed his pace, so she would not need to hurry, keeping his hands in his coat pockets, so he would appear less intimidating. For several moments, they walked in silence until Emily looked up and asked if he worked late like her father did. Jonathan smiled faintly and explained that sometimes he did, although his work usually happened in tall office buildings where people spent hours discussing numbers and decisions that affected many lives. Emily listened with genuine curiosity, even if she clearly did not fully understand what that meant. She said her father fixed machines at a packaging warehouse on the south side of the city, and that he often came home long after she had gone to bed. Jonathan noticed the way she spoke about her father with quiet loyalty, never complaining, only explaining the facts as she knew them. As they continued walking, the neighborhoods began to change slowly. The bright storefronts of the main street gave way to older apartment buildings and smaller houses that showed the wear of many Chicago winters. Emily pointed ahead to a narrow street where the porch lights of several homes glowed softly against the dark sky. She explained that her house was near the end of that block, and that the porch light turning off meant she was late. Jonathan glanced at his watch and realized they still had a few minutes. The paper bag rustled slightly in Emily's hands as the wind passed again, and she instinctively checked that the bread was still inside. Jonathan gently asked if her stepmother would mind that she had stopped at the bakery. Emily hesitated for a moment before answering. She said that sometimes it was better not to explain small things, because explaining too much could make adults think a child had done something wrong even when they had not. The narrow street Emily Carter pointed to felt quieter than the main road they had just left behind, the kind of neighborhood where porch lights and the faint glow from living room windows were the only signs of life after sunset. Jonathan Reed walked beside her at the same steady pace, noticing how carefully she stayed close to the sidewalk edge as if she had memorized every crack in the pavement from years of walking this route alone. The houses here were small and worn but tidy, their wooden steps creaking softly whenever someone opened a door somewhere down the block. Emily slowed slightly and pointed toward a modest gray house near the far corner. A single porch light above the front door cast a pale circle of light onto the wooden steps. She explained that was her home, and that when the porch light switched off, it meant her stepmother believed everyone should already be inside. Jonathan studied the house quietly. The windows were dark, except for a faint light in what looked like the kitchen. He asked gently whether her stepmother knew she had stopped at the bakery. Emily shook her head in a careful motion, the same thoughtful caution she had shown all evening. She explained that sometimes it was easier if adults did not hear about small detours, because it might lead to questions that were difficult to answer the right way. Jonathan noticed the way she said the right way, as if every conversation at home carried invisible rules she had learned to follow. They stopped a few yards from the house so Emily could finish explaining where she needed to go from there. She held the paper bag of bread against her coat and looked up at the porch light again, checking that it was still glowing. Jonathan felt an uneasy thought form in the back of his mind. A child should not have to study a porch light like a clock that determined whether she had succeeded or failed at the end of the day. He quietly asked whether she would be allowed to eat the bread once she went inside. Emily hesitated again, glancing at the bag before answering honestly. She said she would probably hide it in her room and save it for tomorrow morning, because sometimes breakfast was easier to explain than dinner. Emily Carter stood quietly a few yards from the small gray house, while the cold evening wind moved through the quiet street. The porch light above the front door still glowed softly, casting a narrow circle of yellow light over the wooden steps. Jonathan Reed remained beside her, his gaze moving between the house and the little girl who held the paper bag of bread close to her coat, as if it contained something fragile and important. Emily seemed to be measuring the moment, carefully waiting for the right time to walk the final distance to the door. After a few seconds, she looked up at Jonathan with a polite but serious expression. She thanked him again for the hot chocolate and the bread, speaking with the same careful manners she had shown all evening. Jonathan nodded gently and told her that he was glad he had met her tonight. He meant it more than she could possibly understand. Emily gave a small, thoughtful smile, and then turned toward the house, but she only took 2 steps before stopping again. Something in her expression suggested that she wanted to say something else, but was unsure if she should. Jonathan noticed and waited patiently. Finally, she turned back and asked a quiet question that caught him off guard. She asked if rich people ever forgot what it felt like to be hungry. The question was not accusing or angry. It sounded more like genuine curiosity from someone trying to understand how the world worked. Jonathan took a moment before answering because the truth felt complicated. He explained that some people probably did forget, especially if many years passed without hardship, but he also said that certain memories stayed with a person forever. Emily listened carefully, then nodded as if that answer confirmed something she had been thinking about. She explained that sometimes she tried to imagine what life would be like if dinner was something everyone simply expected instead of something they had to earn. Jonathan felt the weight of her words settle deeply inside him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Emily glanced toward the porch light again. It flickered slightly as the wind passed across the street. She quickly straightened, realizing that her time was nearly gone. She thanked Jonathan one last time and began walking toward the house with quick, determined steps. Jonathan remained where he was watching as the small figure climbed the wooden steps and reached for the door. Just before she turned the handle, she looked back once more and lifted the paper bag slightly in a silent gesture of gratitude. Jonathan gave a small, reassuring wave in return. The door opened and Emily disappeared inside. The porch light remained on for several seconds longer before suddenly clicking off, leaving the quiet street in darkness. Jonathan Reed stood there longer than he expected, staring at the empty porch, while a troubling thought slowly formed in his mind. A child should never have to hide bread for tomorrow morning. Jonathan Reed remained on the sidewalk for several moments after the porch light went dark, the quiet street suddenly feeling colder than it had before. The wind moved gently through the narrow block, rustling dry leaves along the curb, while distant traffic hummed somewhere beyond the neighborhood. Jonathan kept his eyes on the small gray house where Emily Carter had just disappeared. The door had closed softly, and now there was no movement, no voices, only the faint outline of the house against the dim streetlights. He had spent decades building companies, negotiating billion-dollar deals, and making decisions that influenced thousands of employees. Yet standing on that quiet sidewalk, he felt something unfamiliar settling inside him. It was the uncomfortable awareness that some problems in the world existed quietly behind ordinary doors, hidden from the places where powerful people usually looked. Jonathan slowly reached into his coat pocket and checked his phone, but he did not call his driver yet. Instead, he continued watching the dark house, replaying the conversation from the bakery and the walk they had just taken. The careful way Emily had spoken about dinner, the rules she followed without questioning them, and the way she planned to hide bread for tomorrow morning all echoed in his mind. None of it sounded like the life a child should have. A faint light flickered inside the house for a brief moment, likely from the kitchen window near the back. Jonathan noticed the movement and wondered whether Emily was already in her room or standing quietly somewhere inside waiting for the right moment to go upstairs. The thought made him uneasy. Eventually, a black sedan rolled slowly around the corner and stopped near the curb where Jonathan stood. His driver, Marcus, stepped out and opened the rear door respectfully, clearly surprised to find his employer standing alone on a residential street instead of finishing the evening meeting they had planned earlier. Marcus politely asked if everything was all right. Jonathan took one last look at the dark porch before answering. He said that plans had changed tonight, and that they would not be returning to the office yet. Marcus nodded and waited for further instructions. Jonathan remained silent for another moment, thinking carefully. He had learned long ago that acting too quickly without understanding a situation could cause more harm than good. Finally, he stepped into the car, but did not tell Marcus to drive away immediately. Instead, he asked him to stay parked for a few more minutes. From the back seat, Jonathan continued looking toward the gray house through the tinted window. Something about this quiet neighborhood and the small girl who believed dinner had to be earned had unsettled him in a way he could not ignore, and for the first time in many years, Jonathan Reed realized that tonight might not simply end when he returned to his penthouse. Inside the small gray house, Emily Carter closed the door quietly behind her and stood still for a moment, listening to the silence of the hallway. The porch light outside had just clicked off, which meant she had arrived barely in time. The house smelled faintly of dish soap and leftover dinner, a reminder that the evening meal had already happened without her. Emily carefully slipped off her worn sneakers and placed them beside the wall so they would not make noise if someone walked past later. In her hands, she still held the small paper bag from the bakery. She looked down at it for a moment before slowly opening the top, just enough to check that the bread was still inside. The warmth had faded during the walk home, but the smell remained comforting. Emily gently folded the top of the bag closed again and held it close to her chest as she quietly walked down the narrow hallway toward the staircase. A faint light glowed from the kitchen at the back of the house, and the low sound of a television could be heard from the living room. Emily paused at the bottom of the stairs, listening carefully to determine where everyone was. This was a habit she had developed over time, the quiet skill of moving through the house without creating unnecessary questions. After a moment, she began climbing the steps, slowly placing each foot carefully so the old wood would not creak too loudly. Upstairs, the hallway was dark, except for a small nightlight near the bathroom door. Emily reached her bedroom and gently pushed the door open. The room was small but tidy, with a narrow bed, a desk for homework, and a bookshelf filled with library books she had borrowed from school. She stepped inside and closed the door softly behind her before finally allowing herself to relax. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she opened the paper bag again and looked at the bread as if it were something precious. She knew she could eat it now, but experience had taught her that saving it for the morning would be safer. Breakfast was easier to explain. Emily carefully wrapped the bread in a clean napkin from her desk drawer and placed it inside a small box where she sometimes kept snacks from school. Once it was hidden, she sat quietly for a moment thinking about the evening. She remembered the warm bakery, the hot chocolate, and the tall man who had walked her home even though he did not have to. For the first time in a long while, Emily allowed herself to wonder whether the stories she liked to read might be possible in real life too. Downstairs, the television continued murmuring softly while the house settled into the quiet rhythm of night. But upstairs in her small room, Emily Carter held on to a new and unfamiliar thought that perhaps kindness could appear in the most unexpected places. Jonathan Reed finally told Marcus to drive, but the black sedan moved slowly down the quiet street, as if Jonathan was not ready to leave the neighborhood yet. Through the tinted window, he watched the row of modest houses pass by, one after another, each porch light glowing softly against the cold Chicago night. Most of those homes looked ordinary, the kind of places people passed every day without thinking twice. Yet Jonathan could not stop thinking about the small gray house they had just left behind. The image of Emily Carter standing in the bakery with 3 crumpled dollar bills replayed in his mind again and again. Marcus eventually glanced at him through the rearview mirror and asked politely where they should go next. Jonathan did not answer immediately. Instead, he asked Marcus a different question. He asked how long Marcus had lived in Chicago. Marcus replied that he had grown up on the South Side and had spent most of his life in neighborhoods not very different from the one they had just visited. Jonathan nodded thoughtfully and then asked something that seemed unusual coming from a billionaire employer. He asked whether it was common for children in those neighborhoods to believe they had to earn dinner. Marcus paused before answering because the question clearly surprised him. After a moment, he explained that many families struggled, but children usually still ate together when food was available. The idea of a child believing she did not deserve dinner sounded troubling even to him. Jonathan leaned back against the leather seat and stared out the window again as the car turned onto a brighter avenue filled with restaurants and late-night shops. The contrast between the warm restaurants and the quiet street they had just left behind felt almost unreal. Inside those restaurants, people laughed, shared meals, and spent more money on a single dinner than Emily had held in her small hand at the bakery counter. Jonathan suddenly remembered something else she had asked him earlier. She had wondered whether rich people forgot what it felt like to be hungry. The question echoed in his mind now with unexpected weight. For years, Jonathan had believed that success meant moving forward and leaving difficult memories behind. Yet tonight reminded him that certain experiences shaped a person forever. He had once been a child who understood hunger too long before he built companies or owned skyscrapers. That realization settled deeply inside him as the car approached the highway leading toward downtown. Finally, Jonathan spoke again, his voice calm but firm. He told Marcus to turn the car around. Marcus hesitated for only a second before following the instruction guiding the sedan back toward the quiet neighborhood where a small girl had quietly changed the direction of a very powerful man's evening. The black sedan turned quietly back toward the neighborhood, where the narrow streets were now almost completely still. Most of the porch lights had gone dark, and the sidewalks were empty except for the occasional shadow of a passing car. Jonathan Reed sat forward slightly in the back seat, his eyes fixed on the familiar block as Marcus guided the car slowly along the curb. The small gray house appeared again at the end of the street, standing quietly beneath the cold night sky exactly as they had left it. The porch light remained off now, leaving the front steps barely visible beneath the dim glow of a nearby street lamp. Marcus gently pulled the car to the side of the road and waited for instructions. Jonathan studied the house for a long moment without speaking. The scene looked ordinary, peaceful even, but the conversation from earlier continued echoing in his mind with growing clarity. Emily Carter had spoken about dinner as if it were a privilege that had to be earned through perfect behavior. And she had accepted that rule with the quiet seriousness of someone who had never been told anything different. Jonathan suddenly remembered another winter night from decades earlier, when he had been a boy no older than Emily. He remembered standing outside a small grocery store with empty pockets and wondering whether the smell of fresh bread could make a person feel full if they breathed deeply enough. It had been a long time since he allowed himself to think about that memory. Success had buried it beneath years of business meetings, private jets, and luxury apartments high above the city. Yet tonight that memory felt close again, as if the quiet street had pulled it back from the past. Jonathan finally stepped out of the car, the cold air hitting his face as he walked a few steps toward the sidewalk. He did not approach the house. Instead, he stood near the street lamp looking at the dark windows and imagining the small girl upstairs, carefully hiding bread for the morning. The thought settled in his chest, like a weight he could not ignore. Marcus watched respectfully from the driver's seat, understanding that something serious was unfolding, even if he did not know the full story. After several silent minutes, Jonathan spoke quietly, almost to himself. He said that no child should ever feel like dinner was something they had to deserve. The words sounded simple but carried the quiet certainty of a decision forming in his mind. For the first time that night, Jonathan Reed understood that meeting Emily Carter had not been an accident of a wrong turn or a random stop at a bakery. Sometimes life placed a person exactly where they needed to be, and sometimes ignoring that moment meant losing something far more important than money. Jonathan Reed remained standing beneath the street lamp while the quiet neighborhood settled deeper into the stillness of night. The cold air moved across the street in slow waves, carrying the distant hum of traffic from several blocks away. The small gray house remained silent, its windows dark except for a faint glow that occasionally appeared behind the curtains upstairs. Jonathan imagined that light belonged to Emily Carter's room. Perhaps she was finishing homework at her small desk or quietly reading one of the library books she had mentioned earlier. The thought made him realize how carefully she seemed to live her life, measuring every word and every step as if mistakes carried consequences she could not risk. Marcus eventually stepped out of the car and approached him respectfully, stopping a few feet away so he would not interrupt his thoughts. Marcus asked quietly if Jonathan wanted to speak with someone inside the house or if they should return in the morning instead. Jonathan considered the question seriously. Acting too suddenly could create confusion for the family, yet walking away tonight did not feel right either. The image of Emily hiding bread for tomorrow morning remained fixed in his mind, like a quiet alarm he could not silence. Jonathan finally spoke, explaining that sometimes the most important decisions began with simply understanding the truth of a situation. He said that before doing anything else, he wanted to learn more about the family that lived inside that house. Marcus nodded in agreement and suggested that local community offices or school records might provide some answers about the household. Jonathan appreciated the practical suggestion, but continued watching the dark windows for a moment longer. Something deeper than curiosity was driving his thoughts now. It was the memory of being a boy who once believed the world had forgotten him. Back then, one small act of kindness from a stranger had changed the direction of his life, giving him the strength to keep moving forward, even when everything seemed uncertain. Jonathan slowly realized that the feeling in his chest tonight was the same quiet urgency he had felt as a child. Life had given him enormous resources, influence, and the ability to change things that once seemed impossible. Yet none of that meant anything if he ignored the moment standing right in front of him. Finally, he turned back toward Marcus with a calm but determined expression. He said they would not disturb the family tonight because Emily deserved a peaceful evening after the long day she had already faced. Instead, they would begin asking careful questions in the morning, starting with the school Emily attended. Marcus nodded again and returned to the driver's seat, while Jonathan took one final look at the quiet house. Somewhere upstairs, a small girl believed that dinner had to be earned, and Jonathan Reed had quietly decided that belief was about to change. The black sedan finally pulled away from the quiet street, but Jonathan Reed did not look back again, because the decision forming inside him no longer required confirmation. The city lights of downtown Chicago stretched across the horizon as Marcus guided the car toward the expressway, yet Jonathan's thoughts remained fixed on the small gray house several miles behind them. Inside that house, a little girl believed that food was something she had to deserve. The idea felt impossible for him to ignore now, because it awakened a memory he had spent years burying beneath success and power. When Jonathan was 9 years old, he had once sat alone on the back steps of a rundown apartment building, holding a single slice of bread someone had given him. He remembered how carefully he had eaten it, making each bite last as long as possible, because he did not know when the next meal would appear. That memory returned tonight, with surprising clarity, not as pain, but as understanding. Marcus drove in silence for several minutes, before asking if Jonathan wanted to return to the penthouse or the office. Jonathan answered calmly that they would go to the penthouse for now because he had work to do before morning. His voice carried a quiet certainty that Marcus recognized from years of working with him. Whenever Jonathan spoke that way, it meant a decision had already been made. As the car moved through the bright downtown streets, Jonathan opened his phone and began writing a few notes. He listed the elementary school Emily had mentioned, the street where her house stood, and the questions he intended to ask the next day. He knew there were proper ways to understand a child's situation without causing unnecessary trouble for the family. The goal was not conflict. The goal was truth. When the car finally reached the tall glass tower where Jonathan lived, Marcus opened the door and wished him a good evening. Jonathan stepped into the quiet marble lobby and took the elevator to the top floor where the city stretched endlessly beneath the windows. From this height, Chicago looked peaceful and distant, a place of lights and opportunity. Yet Jonathan knew that behind many of those lights were stories people rarely noticed. He walked to the large window overlooking the skyline and stood there for a long moment. Somewhere across the city, Emily Carter was sleeping in a small bedroom, unaware that the brief meeting at a neighborhood bakery had already begun changing something far larger than either of them understood. Jonathan placed his phone on the table and looked out across the night one last time before speaking quietly to himself. Tomorrow he would start asking questions, and once he knew the truth, he would not look away again. Morning arrived slowly over Chicago as pale winter sunlight reflected across the glass towers of downtown. Jonathan Reed had not slept much during the night. Instead, he had spent several hours reviewing the notes he wrote before midnight, making careful plans for the day ahead. By 7:30 in the morning, He was already standing near the tall windows of his penthouse, holding a cup of coffee that had grown cold in his hand because his attention remained somewhere else entirely. Across the city in a quiet neighborhood, far from the luxury towers, a small girl was beginning another school day, believing that dinner was something she had to earn. That thought alone had been enough to keep Jonathan awake. When Marcus arrived with the car shortly after 8 o'clock, Jonathan was ready. The black sedan moved smoothly through the busy streets as commuters filled the sidewalks and school buses stopped along residential blocks. Their destination was the elementary school Emily Carter had mentioned the night before. The building stood on a modest corner, surrounded by a playground and rows of brick houses that had seen many Chicago winters. Children were arriving with backpacks and winter coats, their laughter and voices filling the crisp morning air. Jonathan remained inside the car for a moment, watching the scene carefully. Schools often revealed more about a child's life than almost anywhere else because teachers saw what happened when home and childhood met in the same place. Marcus parked along the curb while Jonathan stepped out onto the sidewalk. The cold air felt sharper than it had the previous evening, but his focus remained steady as he walked toward the main entrance. Inside the building, the hallway buzzed with the normal rhythm of lockers closing and teachers greeting students. Jonathan introduced himself politely at the front office and asked if he could speak with someone about a student named Emily Carter. The receptionist looked slightly surprised by the formal request from a well-dressed stranger, but soon directed him to the office of the school counselor. A few minutes later, Jonathan sat across from a middle-aged counselor named Mrs. Peterson, who listened carefully as he explained that he had met Emily by chance the previous evening and had grown concerned about something she said. Mrs. Peterson remained quiet for several seconds after hearing the story. Her expression showed recognition rather than shock, which immediately told Jonathan that Emily's situation was not entirely unknown at the school. She explained that Emily was one of the most polite and hard-working students in her class, but teachers had occasionally noticed that she seemed unusually cautious about food during lunchtime. Sometimes she saved part of her meal in her backpack instead of finishing it. Jonathan felt the quiet weight in his chest return as the counselor spoke. The small details confirmed what he had already begun to suspect. Emily Carter had learned to live carefully in a world where even dinner could feel uncertain, and Jonathan Reed had quietly decided that uncertainty would not remain unanswered. Mrs. Peterson folded her hands calmly on the desk, while Jonathan Reed absorbed the quiet details she had just shared. The counselor explained that teachers often noticed small patterns in children long before anyone outside the school realized something might be wrong. Emily Carter was always polite, always respectful, and she worked harder than most students in her class. Yet those same qualities sometimes revealed how carefully she lived her life. Mrs. Peterson said that during lunchtime, Emily often wrapped part of her sandwich in a napkin and slipped it into her backpack as if she was saving it for later. When teachers gently asked if she was still hungry, Emily usually smiled and said she was full even when her tray was barely touched. Jonathan listened without interrupting the pieces of the story, forming a clearer picture with every sentence. The counselor continued explaining that the school had occasionally sent notes home offering extra support programs such as free breakfast and after-school snacks. But the responses from Emily's household had always been brief and formal. According to the paperwork on file, Emily lived with her father, Daniel Carter, and her stepmother, Laura Carter. Daniel worked long shifts at a packaging warehouse, while Laura handled most of the communication with the school. Mrs. Peterson admitted that nothing in the official records suggested immediate danger, but there had always been a quiet concern among the staff that Emily carried more worry than most children her age. Jonathan asked carefully whether the school had ever spoken directly with Emily about food at home. Mrs. Peterson nodded and explained that Emily never complained about her family. In fact, she often defended them by saying that discipline was important and that she needed to learn responsibility. The words sounded rehearsed to adults who had worked with children for many years. Jonathan felt the same quiet realization he had felt the night before. Emily had been taught to believe that certain hardships were normal. Mrs. Peterson finally leaned back slightly in her chair and studied Jonathan with curiosity. She asked why a successful businessman would take such personal interest in a child he had met only once. Jonathan considered the question before answering honestly. He explained that when he was a boy, someone had once noticed a small problem in his life that everyone else ignored. That moment had changed everything for him. He said that sometimes the difference between a difficult childhood and a hopeful future began with one person deciding to pay attention. The counselor nodded slowly, understanding the meaning behind his words. She told him that if he truly wanted to help Emily, the next step would involve speaking with the proper child support services and carefully understanding what was happening inside that small gray house. Jonathan Reed thanked her quietly and stood to leave the office with a deeper certainty than before. The truth about Emily Carter's life was beginning to unfold, and now that he had started asking questions, he had no intention of stopping. Jonathan Reed left the school building with the quiet determination of someone who had already crossed an invisible line. The winter air outside felt sharp against his face, but his thoughts remained steady as he walked back toward the black sedan waiting along the curb. Children's voices echoed across the playground behind him, while school buses pulled away one by one carrying students toward classrooms where ordinary lessons would fill the day. Yet Jonathan knew that Emily Carter's life was shaped by lessons far more difficult than spelling tests or math problems. When he stepped into the car, Marcus looked at him through the rearview mirror and asked if everything had gone well. Jonathan nodded slowly and explained what the counselor had shared. Marcus listened quietly, his expression serious as the details became clear. When Jonathan finished speaking, there was a brief silence inside the car before Marcus asked where they should go next. Jonathan answered calmly that the next step required speaking with professionals who understood how to handle delicate family situations. Within 30 minutes, the sedan stopped outside a modest government office building that housed the city's child and family support services. The building itself was plain, far removed from the polished corporate towers where Jonathan usually conducted business. But the work happening inside those walls carried enormous importance for families who needed help. Jonathan entered the building and introduced himself at the front desk, requesting a meeting with someone who could discuss a concern about a student he had recently encountered. A caseworker named Rebecca Lawson soon greeted him in a small office filled with folders and reports stacked neatly along the shelves. Rebecca listened carefully while Jonathan described the events from the previous evening, including the conversation at the bakery and the information he had learned from the school counselor. She took careful notes and occasionally asked clarifying questions, her calm professionalism making it clear that situations like this required patience and evidence rather than quick assumptions. After hearing the full story, Rebecca explained that many families struggled quietly without outside support, and sometimes children developed unusual habits around food because of household rules that adults believed were teaching discipline. However, she also acknowledged that Emily's behavior raised important questions worth examining more closely. Rebecca assured Jonathan that her office could begin a careful welfare check on the household to understand what was happening inside the home environment. The goal would be to ensure that Emily's needs were being properly met and that no child felt uncertain about something as basic as a daily meal. Jonathan felt a sense of relief hearing those words, because it meant the situation would be handled with fairness and care. Rebecca thanked him for bringing the concern forward and promised that someone from their office would visit the Carter home later that day. As Jonathan walked back toward the car, he realized that the quiet decision he made the previous night had already set a chain of events into motion. Somewhere across the city, Emily Carter was sitting in her classroom, unaware that several adults were now working together to make sure the small rules governing her life were finally being questioned. Later that afternoon, Emily Carter sat quietly at her desk near the window of her classroom while the final lesson of the day came to an end. Outside, the pale winter sunlight stretched across the schoolyard where children were already gathering their backpacks and preparing to go home. Emily carefully placed her reading book into her bag and then reached for the small napkin where she had saved half of her lunch sandwich, just as she had done many times before. She folded it gently and tucked it into the corner of her backpack with practiced care. Across the room, Mrs. Peterson watched her for a brief moment with a thoughtful expression before returning to her paperwork. Only a few hours earlier, the counselor had spoken with Jonathan Reed and then contacted the appropriate services to begin understanding Emily's situation more clearly. None of that was visible to Emily yet. To her, it was simply another school day ending the same way as many others. When the final bell rang, the classroom quickly filled with the sound of chairs moving and children chatting excitedly about the evening ahead. Emily moved more slowly than the others, always careful to check that everything in her bag was organized before leaving. When she stepped outside the building, the cold air greeted her again, carrying the familiar smell of winter streets and distant traffic. At the edge of the sidewalk, a black sedan waited quietly near the curb. Emily did not immediately notice it as she began walking down the path toward the street. Inside the car, Jonathan Reed watched through the window, his expression calm but attentive. He had returned to the school not to interrupt Emily's day, but simply to make sure she did not have to walk home alone again. As she approached the corner, she finally recognized him standing beside the car. Her eyes widened with surprise, and for a moment she simply stopped walking. Jonathan offered a gentle smile and greeted her warmly, explaining that he had been nearby and thought she might appreciate company on the walk home. Emily Carter stood still for a moment on the sidewalk outside the school, her small backpack hanging from her shoulders, while she looked at Jonathan Reed with a mixture of surprise and cautious curiosity. The winter wind brushed lightly across the schoolyard as other children hurried past them toward waiting parents or school buses. Jonathan kept his tone warm and calm so she would not feel pressured or confused. He explained that he had been in the neighborhood again today and remembered the walk they shared the night before. Emily slowly stepped closer, still studying his face, as if she was deciding whether this moment belonged to one of the hopeful stories she liked to read. She finally offered a polite smile and asked if he had enjoyed the bakery bread as well. Jonathan chuckled softly and told her that he had, although he suspected she had enjoyed it more than he did. Emily seemed relieved by the familiar conversation, and the tension in her shoulders relaxed slightly. They began walking together down the sidewalk toward the same neighborhood street where her house waited several blocks away. Along the way, Jonathan asked about her school day. Emily spoke about a spelling quiz she believed she had done well on, and a story she was reading in the library about a girl who discovered unexpected kindness from strangers. Jonathan listened carefully, realizing how closely those fictional stories resembled the quiet moment that had brought them together. When they reached the corner leading toward Emily's street, Jonathan slowed his steps and gently told her something important. He explained that sometimes adults needed help understanding the challenges children faced, and that people at her school and in the community cared about making sure every child felt safe and supported. Emily listened quietly, not fully understanding every detail, but sensing the sincerity in his voice. As they continued walking toward the gray house at the end of the block, the evening sky began turning soft shades of orange and blue, and for the first time Emily felt a quiet sense that something in her life was beginning to shift. The quiet street appeared again at the end of their walk, as the small gray house came into view beneath the fading evening light. The porch lamp had not turned on yet, and the winter sky above Chicago glowed softly with the last colors of sunset. Emily Carter slowed her steps as they reached the familiar sidewalk in front of her home. For a moment she simply stood there holding the straps of her backpack while looking at the house, and then back at Jonathan Reed. Something about the way the day had unfolded made the world feel slightly different than it had the night before. Jonathan stopped a few feet away, so she would feel comfortable, his posture calm and patient. He told her that he was glad he had seen her again today, and that sometimes small meetings between people could grow into important friendships. Emily thought about that for a moment, before asking a quiet question that carried the same honesty she had shown since the bakery. She asked whether he believed things could really change for someone who had always lived the same way. Jonathan smiled gently, because he understood that question better than she realized. He explained that change often began with a single moment when someone decided that life should be kinder than it had been before. Emily looked down at the sidewalk, thinking about the bread she had saved that morning and the strange feeling that the rules she had always followed might not be permanent after all. Inside the house, a light flickered on behind the kitchen window, signaling that evening had begun. Emily turned back to Jonathan and thanked him once more for walking with her. Before stepping toward the porch, she asked one last thing in a small, hopeful voice. She asked if she might see him again sometime. Jonathan answered without hesitation that he would be around and that some promises were meant to last longer than a single evening. Emily nodded with a quiet smile before climbing the steps toward the door, and as Jonathan Reed watched from the sidewalk, he knew that the small promise he had made to himself the night before was only the beginning of a much larger change. Did this story move your soul? Share your feelings in the comments and rate it from 1 to 10. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Then tap the bell icon so you never miss a new story. Click the end screen to watch another heartfelt video. See you in the next story.